China at that point in the 1990s and the early 2000s was not a major global competitor for US corporations. By the time you get to 2010s, it was. And it's those geoeconomic dynamics that are absolutely central for understanding the deterioration in US-Chinese relations since then and in terms of what they are today.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm Adam Dixon. Today I'm joined by Jeff Henderson. Jeff is Professor Emeritus of International Development from the University of Bristol. He previously has held positions at the Universities of Manchester, University of California, Santa Barbara, and the University of Hong Kong. Jeff's area of interest is East Asian development, and Jeff joins me today to discuss China, and in particular, the role of the CCP, that is the Communist Party of China, and in particular, how it is influencing Chinese Sino-European relations, including those of the United Kingdom. And we'll also talk about, if we have a chance, about China in the new age of Donald Trump. Jeff, welcome to the New Enlightenment.
Thanks a lot, Adam. That was a great introduction.
So you were at the University of Hong Kong in the 80s. You were there for 10 years. You said to me from 81 to 91. So you were there when Hong Kong was a properly British place of Imperial Britain before it was handed over, but also before China truly became the global powerhouse that it is, the economic powerhouse that it is today. This was, yes, it was kind of moving forward, but it really hadn't kicked off until later into the 90s. Perhaps you could kind of give us a sense of what the world was like in Hong Kong back then in East Asia. What was China, mainland China, up to, and how should we understand that period so we can understand China and the CCP today?
Well, of course, Hong Kong was, as it developed under British colonialism, was largely populated from what, after 1949, became the People's Republic of China, with migrant populations, particularly from Guangdong province, the Chinese province adjacent, immediately north of Hong Kong, who were not particularly escaping the CCP. Before and immediately after 1949, but they were economic migrants, basically, right? They were very poor, and they thought they could make a better life, if they lived in Hong Kong. But the first time I arrived in Hong Kong in 1981, as you suggested, and the first time I actually went to China was actually on a day trip just across the border to Shenzhen, which had already been designated at that point as a special economic area. But at that point in 1982, it was a town of maybe 100,000 people, something of that sort, right? There was evidence of, a bit of construction going on, but not that much. Today, it's a metropolis of 14 million people, and is one of the key driving forces, of course, of the entire Chinese economy, and in some ways the global economy, concentrating in, electronics and, high tech of various sorts, et cetera, et cetera. But the first time, I suppose, that visit made me aware immediately of the economic role of the Chinese Communist Party in orchestrating and organizing all this. But the first time that I really became aware of that and aware of it in a research sense was when I visited Beijing for the first time in 1980. I was a guest of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, actually its Institute of Geography, and they'd invited me to give a few lectures on. They were interested in world systems analysis and various stuff like that. So thanks to my host at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, I managed to get access to two foreign invested joint venture operations, manufacturing operations in Beijing. One of which was to Beijing Auto, state-owned then and now, owned by the Beijing Communist Party, not the Central Communist Party. Beijing Auto, which at that time was assembling Jeeps for the Jeep brand, okay, for American Motors. Jeep was an American Motors brand. American Motors subsequently disappeared and was folded into Chrysler and et cetera, right? And the other joint venture that I visited was of HP, Hewlett-Packard, which was assembling computers, Hewlett-Packard computers for the Chinese market. Now, interestingly, in neither of those cases did there seem to be much Chinese input, except the physical labor of assembling the products. The Jeeps, everything, as far as I understood it, was entirely imported from the United States. Similarly with the HP computers, everything imported from the United States and just assembled in factories in Beijing for the Chinese market. And I was interested at that time in the relationship between foreign direct investment and economic development. And I was doing a lot of work in the East Asian context around that. And so I was interested in the advantages of foreign investment for economic development in the particular countries that were hosts to that investment. And anyway, the guy at Hewlett-Packard in Beijing, for instance, that I was interviewing at the time, he was a Chinese guy. I kept going on about the benefits of their hookup with Hewlett-Packard being technology transfer. Mm-hmm. And I said to him, well, everything is imported from the United States. There's not a single thing in these HP computers that's actually made in China at this point. Mm-hmm. So I said, what exactly is the technology transfer that's going on here? He'd clearly never been asked that question before and sort of paused for a while. And then he eventually said, managerial expertise, right? Mm. Okay. Which, of course, in itself was quite interesting because that's one of the things they clearly had to learn if they wanted to become a major industrial society exporting all this kit to the rest of the world, effectively. But because the Chinese firms that were part of these joint ventures linked up with American companies in both cases were both state-owned, then that, brought it sort of highlighted for me the role of the Chinese Communist Party here. Mm. Because the Chinese Communist Party, of course, essentially it's a Leninist state in China fundamentally. And the Chinese Communist Party basically absorbs all of the state apparatus and institutions of civil society into itself, right? Okay. So, when we talk about state-owned companies in China, we're really talking about the Chinese Communist Party.
I just want to pause there for 2 seconds for you to define so listeners understand what you mean by a Leninist state. So, people know who Lenin is, they understand a bit of Soviet history, but what does that mean as a definition? What is a Leninist state and how does it operate through the party for listeners that might not understand that?
Sure. Well, the term obviously refers to the type of state that was constituted in Russia, became after 1917 and became the Soviet Union, and the way it was organized and the way it related to every dimension of Russian society, organizing the economy, organizing the detail of political life down to the smallest village, absorbing you couldn't have institutions of civil society ranging from trade unions through to neighborhood organizations that were not controlled by the party to some extent. And the Chinese Communist Party, of course, after the revolution in 1949, essentially instituted that model, albeit with Chinese characteristics. From then, in various types of ways, there have been changes here and there, much more autonomy at the provincial and city levels in China than there ever was in the old Soviet Union, for instance, political autonomy and decision-making autonomy. Yeah. But essentially, China is a Leninist state in that the Communist Party literally absorbs just about everything goes on in that society. And I'm going to have something to say a bit later about this because it also has implications for the operations of private companies in China and not merely state-owned companies.
Exactly. And I think that's the if you just look at China and you look at the state ownership, you think it's not so state capitalist because there's a lot of private enterprise, but then who's controlling those private enterprises? And we'll come back to that. But so let's go back to 1980s and this joint venture, and it was importing a managerial expertise, and then later on more technical aspects being built in Some even say today that China is now an exporter of knowledge, an exporter of technology. And perhaps we can come back to that. But you mentioned earlier about the CCP as an economic actor. And many like to point out that the CCP isn't all that bad. It's had mess ups problems in the past, but it's also lifted a lot of people out of poverty. So perhaps you can give that bit of a potted history of what happened after 1949. The Great Leap Forward was a disaster, but things changed. How does that figure into our understanding of the Chinese state and the CCP?
Yeah, well, I guess the so-called Great Leap Forward, which happened between 1958 and 1962, is really the first time that the world outside of China really became aware of the CCP specifically as an economic actor. The Great Leap Forward was a name given to it by Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore the leader of the Chinese state at that time, gave to an attempt to rapidly drive China from being a country dominated by peasant agriculture into being an industrial power. In a sense, Mao and his comrades tried to replicate what had happened in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s. And frankly, with similar types of results at a human level. In the Soviet Union, there had been the disruption of the peasant economies that resulted in massive lack of food supply and starvation and what have you. In China, that was true also in China, but at a far greater level. The estimates of the numbers of people who died trying to drive agricultural production to generate surpluses, which could then be transferred into industrial production. That's the classic route, as you know, the classic route to industrialization, which was followed by Britain, by Europe, and rather different way by the United States as well, for that matter. But in the case of China, in attempting to do that, the estimates vary between 15 and 55 million dead from starvation during that period. Quite absolutely extraordinary. So let's touch on something in the middle, let's say about 30 million dead. But boy, right? Okay. So in a sense, the first thing really that the rest of the world knew about the CCP as an economic actor was a complete disaster. Awful. But it's a very long and involved story and what have you, and I don't need to, it's not appropriate here to go through it in any more detail. But there began to be a realization once Deng Xiaoping and his faction had taken over the party after the death of Mao, 1976-77, that the route to poverty reduction, they also knew that China was an incredibly poor country at this point, right? That the route to poverty reduction clearly lay through industrialization. But what they realized is the route to industrialization was in the first instance not by sort of working on China's internal resources only, but by seeking foreign investment. So bringing foreign companies there to produce manufacturing facilities of their own, to sort of link up with Chinese companies in joint ventures so that they could benefit from technology transfers, et cetera, et cetera. And that process began with foreign investment in manufacturing, certainly from the early 1980s. And that's what I first witnessed, going to China in the early 1980s. And of course, as you've already mentioned, in a way, it was spectacularly successful, building China as in terms of levels of output, one of the world's two greatest industrial powers after the United States. Now, but it achieved what Deng and his comrades were interested in achieving as much as anything else: dramatic poverty reduction. The economic reforms in China from the early 1980s, late 1970s, and agriculture actually through to the present day have lifted something like 700 million people out of poverty. Absolutely extraordinary. Surely one of the greatest contributions to human rights, actually, that there's ever been. It really is a remarkable story. Yes, it was done by the introduction of capitalism in the economy in all sorts of ways. But that was fundamentally, because of the nature of the state, as much as anything else, that was fundamentally orchestrated by the Chinese Communist Party. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of what I'm going to have to say from now onwards is going to be critical of the Chinese Communist Party. But it has to be said, and said very clearly, that without the Chinese Communist Party, China as an economy and the Chinese people would have been serious, serious trouble in the present day. The chances are they would have been something like India.
Right.
That they would have been dominated by, an incompetent regime, which is effectively what the nationalists were, the Kuomintang. Mm-hmm. Before the 1949 revolution, they'd been dominated by an even higher levels of corruption than is true today, but is also true within India. Mm-hmm. They would like India, and India is the appropriate comparator to China, of course, because the two states were founded roughly about the same time. China in modern states, that is. China in 1949, India in 1947. They're roughly about the same size in population. India in the last year or so has overtaken China as the most populous country in the world, each with somewhere between 1.4 and 1.5 billion people. Mm. But India, 20 years ago, literacy rates in China were up to about 95%, right? Okay. In India, they were about 70%. That's just one marker. But when you build in all of the data around poverty, for instance, China under the Communist Party is just streets ahead.
Right. But that's not an argument for communism, is it?
That is not an argument for communism, but it is an argument, I think, maybe not an argument, but let me say, it places a question mark over the utility of democratic political regimes attempting to lift seriously poor countries out of that poverty and onto a trajectory of economic growth and development. So, you may know Robert Wade's book, a classic on East Asian economic development called Governing the Market. Towards the end of that book, Robert is very clear about this. He says, until GDP per capita exceeds $4,000, forget about democracy. In other words, democracy is a luxury of development, right? Right. And it can, not always by any means, right? Absolutely not. But it can operate in such a way, for reasons, we don't have time to go into here, to slow down the processes of economic development. So I guess what I'm saying here, if you take another East Asian country like the Philippines, for instance, which has been an economic basket case for the last 50 years or something, well, maybe if the Philippines, and rather than this, a formerly highly democratic political regime, but fantastically corrupt and all the rest of it. Maybe if it had been governed by a clean version of the Chinese Communist Party, maybe the Philippines would have been like, I don't know, at least like Malaysia today, right. Frankly, which it isn't. It's way behind.
Yeah, okay.
So there are interesting questions there, but that's for another conversation.
Right. So, but I think it's important to, as you and I have discussed many times before, it's important to disaggregate what is China. We mentioned the Chinese Communist Party, but it's a country of 1 billion plus people. The CCP has control. But what is China? Who is China? How should we understand that? And then how does that disaggregation allow us a better analytical lens for interpreting what Chinese businesses, the Chinese state, what Chinese people do in the world?
Okay. As far as the Chinese Communist Party is concerned, and this has been true since 1949, it's not just an invention of the current regime under Xi Jinping, right? As far as the Chinese Communist Party is concerned, it is China, right? So China is not the Chinese people particularly, right? Although everything the Communist Party does is done in the name of the Chinese people. But for the party, it is China. It is all-seeing and it's all-knowing in a sense, right? So what this means is that when when I'm talking about we, I'm talking about economic academics and international relations people, politicians, diplomats of that sort, talk about China does this, China does that, China's a problem, we have to be very cautious about China. Then inadvertently, we are reproducing the Chinese Communist Party's narrative about China, right? And that, it seems to me, is very dangerous, because if you get into this mindset of understanding China as a serious problem, then it's a very short step from there, it seems to me, to a situation where you have, McCarthy-style anti-Chinese racism. But in other words, if we have problems, our problems are with China, and they're therefore with the Chinese people. So the point I'm trying to make here is that is a very dangerous route to go down, and it's incorrect. So it seems to me that in our pronouncements, in our discourses around China, we have to be very careful to make sure that where we are criticizing China, our criticisms are leveled at the Communist Party, perhaps even at its current leadership. The Communist Party, after all, is 100 million people.
Right. Yeah.
And it constitutes the economic, the political, the intellectual elites of Chinese society. And so probably many amongst them in private would be quite critical of the current regime in China. But that aside, the issues are with the party. They're not with the Chinese people.
And so, let's talk about the current leadership, Xi Jinping, because I think this is where the West, if you like, lost hope in China. If we think about the opening up towards China, accession to the WTO, the end of history, hope for the liberal international order was that China may not become democratic, but they'll still embrace a certain level of at least economic liberalism and potentially some political liberalism such that they're tolerable. And that was the hope, I would say, at least of 25 years ago, in terms of opening up and bringing China into the international fold. Notwithstanding that China was a cheap producer of manufactured goods, and we benefited from that. That's a separate issue. But the general kind of the political project, if you like, the international political project, was one based on the idea of a liberalizing China, perhaps one that won't be like a Western democracy, a liberal democracy, but one that would be liberal to a degree nonetheless. Xi Jinping has put that idea to bed in a very serious way, whereas previous leaders of the Chinese Communist Party were more open. Is that not true? And so how do you see Xi and his leadership, and what does that mean for understanding China?
Well, you're right that a lot of people in the West assumed that there was some sort of link between the marketization of economies, the development of a capitalist economy, essentially, and political liberalization. The idea was that authoritarian states they don't have the flexibility that is necessary to develop dynamic, innovation-driven economies. I think the thing that happened that caused Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues to become rather cautious was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with that, the state socialist countries of Central and Eastern Europe at the beginning of the 90s. And one of the lessons that they seem to have taken from that is of what they thought had happened in the Soviet Union, which was that under Gorbachev, the Communist Party in the Soviet Union had been liberalized, the whole notion of perestroika, for instance, before the process of economic development. So I think Deng's position, at least this is what I and many people understood it as we understood it at the time, was that you've got to drive the economy to a relatively high level before you can think about the nature of the states and politics in the country, right? Unless you really risk the survival of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I one of the more recent arguments here is in a book by Frank de Kuyter, who's a sinologist and historian at the University of Hong Kong, originally from the Netherlands. His recent book, China After Mao, argues a rather different line. And he argues that the liberalizations which took place in China were not as real as the outside world took them to be. He managed to did a lot of research at local levels. He managed to get into local and city archives, for instance, to find out what was going on at that level before they were closed off to foreign researchers. And de Kuyter argues that actually the intensification of authoritarianism in the Chinese state that there has clearly been under Xi Jinping and his faction, once they took control of the party in 2012, was not a sort of a reintroduction of a more authoritarian set of processes, but it was simply carrying forward what was always there, including under Deng Xiaoping. So economic reforms, yes, but tightly controlled by the party, yeah, okay? But in terms of other forms of liberalization, no.
I want to switch gears slightly and move back to, you had mentioned that the CCP is China, if you like, or it thinks of itself is China, but it's because it's a Leninist state, it is in every institution, public and private, across civil society. And that has implications for how we understand the role of the CCP in Chinese companies, including private companies. So how should we understand a Chinese firm? Is a private owned company independent? How does the party, if you like, exert control on companies?
Okay. Well, first of all, in liberal democratic economies, there is, to a significant extent, direct relationship between ownership of those companies and decision-making control over them, right? So those two things would closely go together in economies such as Britain or the United States, elsewhere in Europe, as part of the definition of what a privately owned economy was. In the context of China, that idea has to be tossed out of the window, because there is not the same direct relationship between corporate ownership and control of those companies in China as there is in Britain, say. Now, there's two routes into this to explain why that's not the case, right? The first of which is to do with the trade unions, right? So this is the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which controls the vast majority of the workforce in China, certainly in urban areas and in manufacturing industries, for instance. And as far as it seems to be the case that the All China Federation of Trade Unions operates almost like a government department, and it is inside, through the workforce, all companies, effectively, or maybe not very small companies, but all companies of any particular size, that's for sure. But the second thing, which has been there for a long time, but has massively increased under Xi Jinping's regime, is that all private companies in China, state companies, of course, it goes without saying, they're controlled directly by the party, but the private companies have had to host party branches of their own. And the latest data on that, but unfortunately it's only from 2017, suggests that something like 93% of all larger private companies in China have party branches, and about 75% of all private companies, irrespective of size in China, host party branches. Now, if you have a party branch, of course, it just, what do they do? Well, what they do is they have a representative, typically the party secretary, who's on the board of directors of those companies. And the the party secretary, in other words, is involved in all of the day-to-day decision-making about that company. Now, the chances are he or she will follow with the whatever the decision making is in terms of normal day-to-day processes. But when it comes to key decisions with regard to strategic investments, what to produce, overseas investments, whatever it happens to be, of significance along those lines, the party secretary almost certainly has a major role in taking the decision within the company.
But I'm just curious though, how
Go on.
does
Yeah.
But there's still a lot of competition in China, right? So I guess what I'm interested in understanding is how there's one thing to have a party membership in the company and, a line of communication upwards, but how is that operationalized from a competition perspective, right? Is it more, because it does seem like China still has a lot of competition, at least within its borders.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
And there's so many different companies, private and state, that my question is, how does the party even have the wherewithal and the capacity to understand this huge economy and to pull the levers, if you like, in a way that's effective? And that's the question that I'm trying to would like to understand better, because I think, and I'll just put this in a different aspect where increasingly, we see state intervention in Western liberal democracies, often as a response to China, but also this idea that we need to compete with China, we need to be more like China, meaning we need to have more state involvement. And that's not to, give an opinion of whether that's good or bad, but it's the analogy with China that I think there's an overplaying of how much top-down control there is in China. Now, I could be wrong, but just considering the numbers of companies and then the degree of competition within China, I'm worried that by relying on this idea that, if we just have more state capital like China or state direction like China, we'll be able to compete with them and we'll have a better industrial strategy.
Okay.
So does that
look,
give you a sense of what's possible?
I think there's maybe a couple of ways into this question. First of all, as I've mentioned, the private companies have party branches, and they're also competing with state-owned companies. And the state and private ownership is a complicated mix, actually, in some cases, which I'll mention in a minute, because it's again a sort of a corporate form, which is unknown certainly in liberal market economies, yeah, or in social democratic societies, for instance. Okay, so the party secretary is on the board of whatever this particular company is, right? But that particular company, say it's, I don't know, Huawei, is in competition with Xiaomi in let's say, mobile phone production and sales, yeah? But that party secretary in Huawei is batting for Huawei, for the company that he or she is actually part of, right? So to the party in that sense, the Huawei's Communist Party, if you like, right? Okay, is batting for Huawei, right? So that doesn't necessarily, on a standard day-to-day competitive in competitive operations, reduce the levels of competition. In some ways, it may even heighten it, right? And so that's one of the things that are going on, I guess. The party secretaries are indeed loyal to the companies which they're part of, right?
Okay.
But they're also crucially party cadre, right? Mm-hmm. So that it's at the key moments, right? So for instance, right? If let me try and think of a more concrete example. Okay, if for instance Geely, which is a Chinese privately owned Chinese automobile company that, amongst other things, owns Volvo, has done since Ford sold it to Geely in 2012, I think, or thereabouts. It's also a 10% owner of Mercedes-Benz, as it happens, as well as other investments in Europe. If Geely were to decide, if the CEO and the people immediately around him or her, I don't know what gender they happen to be, but decided, let's say, to sell their stake in Mercedes, right? But that the party decided that was not a good thing, right? Okay. yeah, then they would presumably be instructed, no way. Keep your investments in Mercedes, right? Okay. So it's the party kicks in other words, when there are strategic decisions to be made.
Right.
Okay. It's probably not that interested when it comes to day, week to week, year to year competition between companies in China in the same industrial field, for instance.
Right.
But the second way in which competition is maintained and introduced goes back to the point that I made in passing earlier on, is that one of the differences between the nature of the Chinese state and the state of the former Soviet Union is that the Chinese state is much more decentralized in terms of its decision than the Soviet Union ever was, in terms of its decision-making structures, and not merely down to the provincial level, but down to the levels of the cities and sub-city levels as well. So what that means is that the party branches are linked to the parties within their particular city or within their particular province. They're not. That's the sort of chain of command.
Right.
It is not to the central party in Beijing. And as a consequence, you have set up all sorts of competitive dynamics between companies associated with, let's say, the Guangdong Communist Party or the Communist Party of Shenzhen compared with the Communist Party of Hangzhou, for instance, in Fujian province, just to the south and whatever. So you have a competition within local parties and the companies that they are affiliated with, as it were, right? Which is in a way overlying the general dynamics of inter-capitalist competition within China. Yeah. You also have this complex ownership mix, which I referred to earlier, where you have a situation where some state-owned companies, typically not those owned and controlled by the central state, but by municipal governments, by city parties, in other words, that have companies that are actually owned now by a majority of private investors. So let me give you one example. There's a company called Zoomlion, which is, I think, a company which is linked to the government and therefore the party in Tianjin. I may be wrong about that. I'd have to check it, but certainly it's linked to one of the cities in eastern China, right? It's one of the companies which operates in Europe. It's got investments in Italy in particular, for instance, right? Something like 75% of its ownership is now private. I don't know for certain, but part of its ownership is probably floated on the Shanghai or the Shenzhen stock exchanges. But the party, if you like, has the golden shares.
Right. Yeah.
So it doesn't have to own the whole damn thing in order to control it.
Right.
So you have these sort of odd mixes like that.
So let's move on to, because you mentioned Europe there, and I failed to mention earlier that you are one of the founders of the China in Europe Research Network, which looks at the influence of China in Europe as well as the United Kingdom. From what you've said about how we should understand China in 2025, what are the implications for Europe and the UK on Chinese investment? So here in Scotland, there's been a lot of concern around investment into green energy production through Minyang, a turbine manufacturer. And that's caused a bit of concern that China is investing in British energy. And that's just one example. I mean, you can look across Europe and there's concerns about that. Are those concerns valid? Should we be concerned about innovation and IP? What is the general state of, there's those that think we should embrace China even more, but increasingly there are those that want to cut ties and cut all ties with China.
I think you've got to treat this question industry by industry, indeed industrial branch by industrial branch. So there clearly are sectors of the British and European economy that have attracted Chinese investment that in terms of, let's stick with Britain for a moment, British economic security and innovation feeding into new intellectual property developments that are fairly unproblematic in those sectors. So, for instance, an obvious example, there's a Chinese privately owned Chinese conglomerate called Fosun, which is possibly best known in Britain, if it's known at all for this, by being the owners of Wolverhampton Wanderers Football Club. It also owns the Thomas Cook tourism brand, for instance. It owns Portugal's largest insurance company. It's a diversified company operating in a whole series of sectors across services of various sorts. Now, that seems to me to be completely unproblematic. From the point of view of issues around productivity, of IP development, of secure economic growth, of ultimately political and geopolitical security as well. Okay, and there's other sectors of that sort. One might be able to make an argument, not as strong as I've made the argument for service industries of that sort, but an argument in terms of financial services. Maybe in some of investments in some of the financial services, they are less problematic than investments in, new rounds of nuclear energy, into, power generation more generally, whatever it happens to be. So it seems to me that the British government and European government clearly have to be very cautious in their dealings with Chinese companies. They need to know what their strategic industries and companies are. Frankly, I doubt that the British government knows that, right? It may have a sense of what it's, and I'm talking about commercially strategic, okay? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm talking also about companies and industries that are vital for the economic future of Britain or Europe, wherever we're concerned about, or the United States, or whatever it happens to be. So they need to know what the key companies are that are likely to be drivers of that type of economic future. And in as far as they are sensitive companies from that point of view, or sensitive industries, then they do seem to need some sort of protection, it seems to me. So you mentioned the issue of wind power and in Scotland. Chinese companies have made massive strides, of course, in wind energy, in the production of the turbines and the electronics associated with that. But one of the problems is that if you operate within a country's energy producing industries, is that you automatically get access to the computerized programs. Mm-hmm. That are associated with the distribution of that electricity. This is one of the things that the European Union was concerned about when the state-owned energy generator State Grid from China took over the Portuguese electricity generation, as it did in 2009, I think, right? Is they weren't particularly concerned about Chinese control of the generation of Portuguese electricity as such, but they were very concerned that State Grid would have access to the programs that actually control electricity distribution, not merely in Portugal, but because Portugal is linked to the rest of Europe across the European Union. So these are considerations, it seems to me, that need to be taken into account here. They're important and they need to be taken seriously. Because the Chinese Communist Party is not a friendly actor. Well, that's what it has to say.
That was my question, because you can kind of look and say, well, what should we worry about, right? I mean, are they so nefarious that they'll turn the power off, turn the lights off? Is that a risk, a viable risk? Would they take that? Would the CCP take that risk, assuming that the consequences for them would also be significant? You seem to suggest that we shouldn't even give them that possibility.
Well, I think and this is where you've got to keep an eye on the geopolitical context and what's happening there. We seem to be, partly thanks now to Mr. Trump and his friends in Washington, we seem to be entering a much more tricky and a much more dangerous international environment. And if that's the case, one has to be forewarned, I suppose, about the possibilities of how that might deteriorate further and what the consequences of that deterioration might be for countries such as Britain, which for this moment in time continue to be close allies of the United States. So yes, the idea that the Communist Party might instruct whoever the Chinese company is that's running the turbines in Scotland to intervene to screw up the computer systems that closes down the British electrical generation electrical distribution system. In a sense, it may seem far-fetched, but I think that the overall economic and political security of Britain as we move into an increasingly dangerous geopolitical era of which China, for better or for worse, will be a player within that and one of the 3 or 4 major players within it. I think that has to be taken into account. We can't simply apply these, relatively free market, relatively economically liberal notions anymore.
No, and I have Adam Smith behind me, and he was very clear. I mean, he was a free trader in many respects, but national security for him was still paramount, because if you didn't have national security, you couldn't have a prosperous internal economy, a commercial society that frees individuals to innovate and do what they need to do. So it's not even, again, counter to liberal ideas that national security should be a consideration. Though there is a debate, and I had Sam Gregg on the podcast a while back, and his point about national security is it becomes really difficult to then decide, well, what industries do you protect and not? Which ones fall under national security and what? And I think that's the big kind of question, is that it starts to become that every industry needs protection because, well, we need steel to make tanks. We need IT to run the defense system. So it becomes this, every industry is going to get protection. And that's where I think there has to be a debate about what happens. Now, I want to have one final question, and we don't have time for a really long answer, but you say that the world has moved into a very precarious, and I would agree with you, geopolitical state, and it's quite uncertain. I'm still of the mind that the United States has not turned its back on the West, despite some name brand commentators saying so. What can be done to reduce tensions? Because a lot of this, the rise in tensions, is concern over China. But it doesn't benefit anyone to have conflict. It's still, and again, pointing to Adam Smith behind me, trade generally is good. The opening up of China was also part of their pulling people out of poverty. Yes, I mean, you mentioned the CCP was very active in it, but it was also an embrace of, being part of the international field. I mean, in prosperity in China also still is, dependent on and supported by trade and openness. So I'm of the mind that we should aim for that. And my concern is that the world is closing in on itself, or people are closing in on itself. What can be done to return, and perhaps I'm an idealist here, to a more open and liberal world economy where we're not worried about conflict and where geopolitical concerns are put to the side? It's a long question. Perhaps we don't have that much time to answer it.
Yeah, I feel the problem, Adam, as you appreciate, is that our geopolitical concerns have overridden those issues consistently certainly from way back into the 19th century, if not earlier. And we both know what the problem is here. And at root of the concerns, at root of the reason why there was this deterioration in the United States' relations with China from the round about 2013, 2014, is that it wasn't simply because China had a more a robustly nationalist general secretary of the party and president of the country in Xi Jinping. It was fundamentally about the fact that by then, Chinese companies were major competitors for their US equivalents, right? The cozying up to China that went on in the 1990s, in spite of the Tiananmen Square, well, let me be nice and use the Chinese term, incident, right? In 1989, China at that point in the 1990s and the early 2000s was not a major global competitor for US corporations. By the time you get to the 2010s, it was. And it's those geoeconomic dynamics that are absolutely central for understanding the deterioration in US-Chinese relations since then, and in terms of what they are today. All of this, all of the rest of it about, associated, issues, bound together by nationalism and concern for whatever, is in a sense just a sort of an ideological layering. That's the fundamental issue. Is that Chinese corporations, just as Japanese corporations did in the 1970s and 1980s, are competing the shit out of their US equivalents, right? And major Chinese capitalists, and perhaps including Mr. Musk himself, don't like it effectively. This reverberates, resurfaces in the federal government, and et cetera, right? So I, think that this idea that we can easily turn to a period of, liberal politics, being nice to each other, carried along by, relatively free international trade is unfortunately out the window, certainly for the foreseeable future.
Jeff Henderson, thanks for being on the New Enlightenment podcast.
Thanks a lot, Adam.
You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.